Welcome to Inland Insight with IECN, hosted by Manny Sandoval and Denise Berber. Welcome to Inland Insight with IECN. My name is Manny Sandoval.
I'm Denise Berber.
And today we have a very special guest. I feel like every guest is special, but today, even more special, we have the publisher of Frontline Observer, Anthony Victoria. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you both so much for having me on. It's really a privilege to be back. Yeah.
So explain to all of our viewers, listeners, what Frontline Observer focuses on and what other work you're involved in. What's your passion when it comes to reporting?
Absolutely. So the Frontline Observer began in 2020. It was basically my effort to try to use journalism, something that I'm very passionate about, to address environmental justice issues. I saw that there was really great coverage on environmental issues already existing in the Inland Empire, but I felt like there needed to be a little bit more of a niche, a focus. And so that was my main reason for starting it. At that time, I was a community organizer working in media strategy, and I felt like this was my way to basically merge my two passions, which is community journalism and advocacy, right, into one platform. Yeah.
Got it. And so also, just really briefly, I know you're doing some work with KVCR as well. What are you doing with them?
Yeah, so with KVCR, I am a news reporter there, way of UC Berkeley's California Local News Fellowship. This is a 2-year fellowship that provides reporters who want to either re-enter the field or want to get an early career start in the field to have 2 years to do important reporting in a newsroom. And I just so happen to have the lucky privilege of staying here at home and doing reporting through KVCR, audio reporting, especially broadcast journalism.
Got it. And so, in today's episode, we're obviously tackling the region's escalating climate crisis with the warehousing industry's impact on air quality and public health. And so, just to hop right into it, why is the Inland Empire such a hot spot for warehouses in the logistics industry?
Yeah, so I think if you wanted to sum it up in a nutshell, it's all about position and space. Historically, the Inland Empire has been central to goods movement. You think of the Cajon Pass and that thoroughfare and how, pre-modern times, pre-industrialization times, you had the movement of goods, right? You had folks like the Mormons and others who were passing through these areas to settle here in this region. So even tracing back to those times, you saw that this was like a hub. Right. And so historically, it's been just I think, an essential space for the movement of goods, the movement of people in some cases.
What makes it a great space for that anyways? What's in place that makes it a great space for all of that, would you say? Yeah,
so I think the fact that it's close to Los Angeles being the large metro area it is today, the fact that you have the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which are the largest port complexes, I think, in the world, right? And so, yeah, it's very strategic for that, right? Here, we're only about an hour, 50, 60 miles away from the ports. And so it makes it very, I think, prime for that kind of space, right? Warehouse space, that is, because you have a goods movement that's moving through the ports that eventually comes here to the IE, and these goods are housed here in the IE and then distributed all across the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
So warehousing has brought undeniable economic opportunities to the region, but it comes at a steep environmental and even social cost. So what would you say were the main impacts, what the main impacts have been, air quality, public health, in regards to those type of things?
Yeah, so this industry, I'll just preface it by saying that this industry provides a lot of economic promise, right? The Inland Empire had arguably a pretty high unemployment rate, maybe like about 10, 15 years ago. You'd probably have to fact check me on that, right?
Due to Norton too, right? Wasn't that the closure of the base?
Yeah, and that goes back like about 30 years, like 3 decades now. But to your point, Manny, the decline from that closure and also from the closure of places like Kaiser, led to this industry being prevalent. But the cost of that, I think we're seeing now. You have, like you're saying, Denise, some of the worst air quality in the nation. The American Lung Association has ranked both Riverside and San Bernardino counties for worse for ozone, which is basically smog pollution, I think that they've gotten the number 1 and 2 designations for like the last 20 years now or so. So that's an example, right? And people might argue, well, warehouses don't have any smokestacks. It's not like it's a stationary source of pollution, which is true. But I think the key thing here to consider is the movement of trucks that is causing, right? And specifically, a lot of these trucks are diesel or methane gas that emits things like nitrogen oxide and PM 2.5. That causes a lot of health impacts on people's lungs.
Yeah. So it affects the overall quality of life.
Absolutely.
Especially in overburdened cities like Rialto, where there are so many empty warehouses and then propositions to build more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to build on that, places like Rialto are an example, right, of how much warehouse growth has developed in the last 15 to 20 years. I'm a native of Rialto. I grew up there, and I've seen firsthand how, very open-ended places or, places with open space, like along Baseline and Ayala/Cedar, used to be very open. Now you have warehouse corridors that take up that whole street. And again, I think some folks will argue, yes, the valuable impact of that is that you have places like the Renaissance Parkway, which, could be attributed to maybe the tax rates and things of that sort.
Right.
But then if you look at the other side of that, now you have more truck traffic, you have more traffic, and you have more people with more like respiratory issues, right? And places like Rialto, and this is me, I think this is my opinion. You have seen a lot of economic growth, but I've noticed that there's certain areas of the city that have also declined, and these tend to be areas where there's a lot of people of color or working class people, for sure.
So in that regard, I grew up in Colton, so railroads everywhere, everywhere, and we haven't had those same economic booms that Rialto has. So it's more detrimental than beneficial in cases like that.
I think like what environmental justice advocates argue is that it is more detrimental because of the costs of health, right? I read somewhere, and I think I reported on this one time, that hospital costs attributed to lung issues, right, lung diseases, respiratory problems, have increased in the last couple of decades because of goods movement, right? I think some cities have been more successful than others. I know I've, through my capacity at IECN before, I used to cover Colton a lot, and
we didn't really mention that yet, but he did write for IE Community News for a number of years. What's funny about that is every once in a while, it was recently a story on Colton, just to kind of quickly sidestep, but it was about this development in Ritchie Canyon specifically, and I was kind of doing some research, came across an article from Anthony from 8 years ago.
Nice.
This was about 2 weeks ago, but
cool.
Quick side story, but
yeah, and just a quick side note too. I think to go back to my experience, right? That's also what compelled me, right? Because I had the experience working with you all, that got my foot in the door, and I think that's what compelled me to come back was, to be on the ground, to be listening to these stories, and so, I hope we can get into our collaboration work a little bit later. But to your point, right? Like these are issues that have been taking place for years, right? Development issues with economic development. Some cities, right, like Colton, have staggered a little behind. Others, like Rialto, have prospered. That can be boiled down to political leadership. It could be boiled down to the lack of community engagement. But I think what I'm seeing across the board that is sort of like the underlying theme are just the placement of warehouses right next to homes and
schools.
Yeah.
That's the one that gets me is what is the regulations with schools, and what's currently the amount of footage that a warehouse can even be to a school?
That's a great question. And again, please feel free to fact check me on this, but there was discussions about this at the state legislature as recent as last fall, or last summer, I should say. I think there's discussions about trying to expand buffer zones. I think right now, per AB 98, that was an assembly bill that was passed back in, when was it? I want to say late August, early September, at the end of the state legislature, that makes it state law to require developers to build warehouses no less than 300 feet away from sensitive receptors, that being schools, that being parks, community or residential areas. There's been efforts by senators now, right? By Eloise Gomez-Reyes, who was once
Right.
an assembly member, now a state senator. I think there's discussions of trying to improve that state bill or state law so that there's more protections. But I think right now, per state law, to my understanding, it's only like a 300-foot buffer zone that's required.
Oh, wow.
But I think that also might depend on the local area or the
Yeah.
local city. Local cities ultimately can decide we're going to adopt our own ordinance, and so you do have
Because in Bloomington, I remember there's some houses that were, that a neighborhood that existed. And how close was a specific warehouse? Because I remember there was one built that was like super close.
Yes.
Basically in their backyard. They walked to the back,
Wow.
and if they wanted a grill, they had a giant, like 30
Exactly.
feet tall build. How I feel like you might know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think this is the Slover Distribution Center, which now is Amazon DAX8. It's off Slover and Laurel, and that, to my understanding, that was like about 70 feet from the home of a community member there. That community member ended up moving. They were really huge community advocates, environmental justice advocates. If you all read the reporting, you'll probably recognize their name, Thomas and Kim Rocha. And I mean, they ended up leaving, right, after being so staunchly against warehousing, advocating against warehousing. Like a lot of families, they just decided to get up and leave because it's just the impacts are so severe.
Are you encountering this more with people being pushed out of their residential areas and because they don't want to be near the warehouses anymore?
I haven't really spoken to a lot of people, unfortunately, that have shared, I want to move because of X, Y, and Z, but we are in touch with I'm in touch with community advocates, right, that have said that they've spoken to residents who have shared with them, well, you know what, I already sold because I'm tired of this. And in some cases, there's folks that say, well, I mean, I'm selling because I'm getting more money out of, selling my property. I can get a newer house. I can live somewhere where there's less warehousing. So I think it varies. I did briefly encounter, there was a meeting about the Bloomington Business Park specific plan, right, which we've all covered. This is, just for context, this is a 213-acre project that is going to build warehousing in South Bloomington, right below the 10 freeway.
Gotcha.
And that's been tied up in lawsuits, right, because of the nature of how the project was approved. And there was a community meeting to try to address some of the concerns around what's called the environmental impact report, right? Every project, as we all know, requires this kind of analysis.
Yeah.
And this was being challenged in court. So they had a meeting, and there was a real estate agent that was at this meeting that spoke out and basically shared, hey, like, I live in Bloomington, and I feel like this project's actually good for our community. Then I asked her to elaborate after the meeting, and she shared, well, look, like, I understand the concerns of a lot of the community members here, but where are the stories of people who have actually been satisfied with this project and also who have decided to sell? And so I found that to be interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I'm sure there are economic factors in each individual family, too.
Exactly.
Some people can't afford to move. They can't afford to leave. And then that affects lower income areas, I'm sure, a lot more than.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I guess we could debate like whether it's the right or wrong thing to like sell your home or, to decide to stay and fight. I think what I'm recognizing is that, developers have a lot of influence in local decision making. And we can, again, debate whether it's right or wrong, but the fact of the matter is that does happen.
I do remember recently there was a warehouse development in Rialto that got declined, essentially. And I remember that developer was up presenting in front of the city council, and I want to say this was towards the fall of 2024. And he basically got, some signatures from neighbors, letters of support from only the people that, were possibly didn't care about the project, but completely missed all the houses where they knew they were going to get pushback from. And so when they pushed it to city council, it was like, we have 200 residents that are supportive of this project, blah, blah, blah. and one of the council members was, rightly so, spoke up and said, okay, but there's this amount of houses in the neighborhood. What about all these other people? And then, during the public comment, which came after that presentation by the developer, that's when someone said it's because there's like 60 of us who do not want this in our community whatsoever. And I just found that to be very eye-opening, that so many developers, not just in this community, but even just nationwide and across the globe, can definitely, and that's a big PR move. People can present something as if it's supported and as if it's, great for the community, put all these perks in for the community, new street lights, donate $20,000 to the local school district, but then still pollute their air and, bring even harsher impacts to that community and that child, those kids in that school, than what their $20,000 check is going to do. Buy pencils. Like, it's not a even trade-off.
We get an influx of press releases from people advocating this huge company donated $20,000. They did this. They don't tell us about the residents out there protesting. And, the residents have to come to us and say, no, we're protesting. We don't like this. Yes, they gave us 20 grand, but our kids are sick. We're getting sick. The soil's getting polluted, that kind of thing.
Right. And then I think what I try to challenge developers sometimes with is, well, you're sharing that these are the benefits, but what about the other residents, to y'all's point, right, who are sharing these concerns about air quality? And then I think and I'm going to use like Bloomington as an example, but with Bloomington, I know that a part of that agreement with Howard Industrial Partners is to try to improve the infrastructure there. So like the sewage and the water systems there in particular. Right now, I can only imagine how flooded Bloomington is, right? Sure. Especially in that southern part. And so in these times, I wonder, well, where are the benefits of these projects, right? Because if the promise is to pave more sidewalks, to improve the infrastructure, then why is that not happening soon enough, right? And then, and to be fair, maybe it is in other areas, but in these more, I think, disadvantaged areas like Bloomington, I'm wondering, like, well, where's that impact? Where's that positive impact, right? And so, to y'all's point, for sure.
Yeah, aside from the initial, we're doing good.
Exactly.
Where's the follow-up? Years down the road, when you're really seeing the effects of these things.
You mentioned the EIRs, the environmental impact reports. Are those able to be slanted and like misconstrued as well?
I think I mean, man, I don't want to say too much because I'm not a lawyer, but I think what I've seen based on like environmental justice, like the arguments of environmental justice advocates, organizations like Earth Justice, and the orgs that they represent, like the People's Collective for Environmental Justice, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. The arguments they make is that sometimes they overlook certain things, so they might like maybe not consider every truck impact or traffic impact. Maybe they'll overlook
to maybe do a more favorable assessment, possibly.
So I think that's like, I know that's a little broad, but I just don't want to speak too much that I'm not an expert. But to your point, I think there is room for that to happen, and I think that's why sometimes you have these legal arguments.
I could just imagine if I was a developer, pay you a little more to do a favorable assessment.
I didn't see that part.
Exactly.
That could be the case, and I do think that sometimes they do work with certain consultants. Because these consultants tend to provide them with favorable environmental impact reports. It's like, not to compare it because I think it's way different, but it's like with media strategy, right? If you're a strategist, you're going to get a client that's going to say, hey, I want you to build this message for me that's favorable to my brand or my company. You could look at it the same way with like maybe these legal consultants, right? And it's not to insinuate that maybe they're breaking the law or anything to that point. But it does, there's room for interpretation when it comes to environmental law. And I think that's what makes it unique. Now, with the Trump administration now, there might be more room for developers to maybe win some of these cases, especially if we're talking federal law. State law might be a little different because obviously California has pretty, I would say, strong environmental protections for sure.
Speaking of that, too, you mentioned the president. And so, South Coast AQMD has been doing a lot of advocating and making some positive change for cleaner air in the IE community, Southern California in general. But, I know they had a electric railroad sort of plan announced. Is any of that compromised? Can you explain what those plans were, and if those are in any sort of compromised situation as of February 2025?
So yeah, just to scale back a little bit on the rules, and I'm gonna go over several rules. I know we're talking about the rail yard one, but so there's this set of rules called indirect source rules, right? And what the name refers to is the regulation of mobile sources of pollution, right? Hence the name indirect source rule, right? Because as I mentioned before, a warehouse might not have a smokestack itself, but it will have things like trucks, maybe even forklifts that do emit pollution. So when you're regulating those sources, those indirect sources, quote unquote, then you are addressing the sources of pollution, right? In 2021, they approved the warehouse indirect source rule that addresses indirect sources of pollution at warehouses. In 2000, I want to say it was 2023, maybe even last year, they approved the warehouse indirect source rule for rail yards. That addresses the same thing, like mobile sources at rail yards. And they are also working on what's called an indirect source rule for marine ports. So it's basically like the ports of LA, ports of Long Beach. Specifically, when it comes to these rules, if they're compromised, the short answer is yes. The long answer, I think, is a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
And why they're compromised is because the AQMD is a regional agency, right? So they cover 4 counties, right? Basically the SoCal Air Basin, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties, or LA County, maybe if I didn't mention them, sorry. Basically those 4 counties, and the AQMD in itself is in some ways in conjunction working with the California Air Resources Board, which is the state agency that oversees air quality across California. So, like, for example, when it comes to the to these sets of rules, the AQMD has to go to CARB and say, hey, look, like, these are a set of rules. This is how we're addressing air issues in our region. We're just letting you know so that you can have this set of standards to use and replicate as well. We can help you all achieve these zero emission standards, right? So like the state announced, we want to reduce emissions for trucks by 2035, 2040. Yeah. The AQMD says, okay, great, that's awesome. We're in alignment with y'all with these goals, but we're doing it here in our basin, right?
So do you
Does
feel
that make sense?
Yes. So my question is, in that regard, do you feel like it requires more collaboration because there are so many agencies? Do you think it helps, or do you think it prolongs the process?
That's a great question. I think in some ways, a lot of folks feel like it prolongs the process. And I think here's why. Sometimes you'll have finger pointing is what I've observed of both agencies, actually, frankly, of both the California Air Resources Board and the AQMD, is that sometimes the AQMD will say, well, we need more policy levers. And by that, they mean we need CARB to help us do our job. We need the EPA to help us do our job. And that was during the Biden administration more so, and before then the Obama administration, right? Under Trump, that looks different. I think what I'm recognizing, and what I recognized in the past, is that under Trump, it's more we need to make sure that we use what we have now existing. So I think, like, to answer your question, I think a little bit better, the collaboration happens. It's not as clear cut sometimes. I think with CARB and the AQMD, there's a better relationship there. I think overall with the EPA, it's a little different just because the EPA in some ways has stalled. In the case of like truck regulations in particular, you know, basically the EPA was supposed to pass what's called a waiver, which would basically make California's air standards the high standard for states to adopt across the nation. That didn't happen because it didn't happen before Biden transitioned out. So now what we're seeing at the regional level is agencies like the California Air Resources Board saying, well, now we need to roll back our regulations around electric trucks because it's not going to be feasible now that we have a Trump administration, because Trump has basically made it clear that he does not believe in the transition, or maybe that he doesn't not believe, but that it's not efficient, and that he prefers to rely on more traditional fossil fuel technology.
So that makes me think, if we keep going, especially in the Inland Empire, in our area, if we keep going and developing at the rate that we are in terms of the logistics industry, what does that mean for the residents in this area, what does that mean for the young kids in terms of just everything from job growth to public health?
Yeah, with job growth, I think there is opportunity with job growth in the sense of warehouse jobs. Whether the quality of those jobs is good is up for debate. You know, in my conversations with the Inland Empire Economic Partnership, they've argued that these jobs, again, provide growth for the region, economic growth, right? It's brought down unemployment rates. It's provided a strong sector of economic prosperity. You see private public partnerships with local school districts around logistics pipelines. They see that as a positive. The argument against that is that that might be the only strong sector that exists, which doesn't leave room for other avenues of economic prosperity. And more importantly, it diminishes how regionally, like, you know, economic players or, you know, political players see the Inland Empire, right? I think the concern of a lot of labor advocates, environmental justice advocates, is that by looking fully at logistics and warehousing, we're only setting up the future, right? So if we're talking about like the future workforce, right? Students now, children now, if we're gearing them towards logistics, are they only going to be geared towards warehousing jobs? Is there room for engineering jobs or technology jobs? I think folks are starting to look at those avenues. But yeah, it's kind of hard to say. If that makes sense.
What's been the push then with making them finally realize that there are these issues that arise in, you know, we mentioned public health and all the other areas. What would you say has been like the pivotal point as to why some moratoriums have been put in place in more recent years?
I think the pivotal point has been I think just the number of warehouses that exist. I think it was Ed Scott in Rialto maybe that said this a couple of days ago, right?
Gotcha.
That he was like, I think he mentioned that, you know, a lot of people are getting frustrated, waking up, looking at warehouses, right? Like first thing in the morning, they open the window, there's a warehouse. And he was insinuating that like people didn't move to Rialto for this reason. Right. People moved to Rialto to get open space. I mean, just to tap into my own personal story, right? Like when my parents moved from LA County to the IE to Rialto specifically in the early 2000s, they came here for the opportunity to buy a home, to have open space. And that's why for me, it's been very interesting to see how my hometown has shifted so much, you know?
And then so many people too, I feel like IE residents, especially for the younger generation, they think it's normal.
Yes.
You know, you're grown into a whole
it
warehouse.
was normalized for me. Colton, you know, there's a railroad in the backyard.
Right.
You know, you have to walk over the tracks to get to school. It was normalized. And, and now years down the road, we're seeing the impacts of that, the health impacts and the air quality and all of those things affecting.
Absolutely. You know, I like to look at things historically, right? Just to preface, like I studied history. I sort of stumbled into journalism accidentally. I just said, hey, I want to do some reporting. I don't know how to report. Long story short, like in my work, I've always tried to, when possible, try to implement historical elements, if that makes sense. And to your point, Denise, I think in Colton, that's a case study for environmental injustice, arguably, right? Because along, you know, we all know that Colton at some point was segregated through the rail tracks and then eventually the freeway. But there's also things like Cal Portland cement that used to, you know, kick up dust. People would complain. I think like as early as like 2017, I wrote a story for the Colton Courier, and I remember the lady, you know, there's this lady that brought in like a pile of dust, and she's like, see, look, this is what I'm talking about. This is the dust. I collected all this dust. And all that to say that like all these things have
a 5 sensory experience.
Yeah, exactly. I was fascinated by that, and it was just like, wow, like, but to see that even all the way up to like almost the 2020s, the fact that, you know, this very legacy based company was still providing issues, right? And now the fact that if you go to that same site, what do you see? You see a bunch of cargo crates, right? That used to be, you know, that are now on the site of what used to be Mount Slover, right? Those are the things that I think are the underlying factors of why you continue to see things like warehouse growth right next to schools and homes, because I think historically there's, you know, in places like Colton, maybe even places like Rialto, even places like North Redlands, to be honest. That's why you see kind of disproportionate rates of industrial development, because there's, I think, a perception, whether it's intentional or not, that these communities should be designated for this kind of stuff. And I
Yeah.
think in some ways it's super unfair, you know?
What was one of the first IE cities specifically that started getting a big boom in warehouses? Do you know that?
I would say that's a great question. I would say
I don't know. Ontario just kind of,
Ontario.
I'm thinking.
Ontario. Yes, you're
I
right.
didn't know the answer. That was just a great, I mean, I'm not saying it was a great guess, but it was a guess.
Well, it's a good guess, and it's the right guess because Ontario, because of the airport, right? So if we're talking logistically,
Yeah.
it's ideal because you have an airport hub there, right?
Yeah.
You can move cargo through air. You have rail there nearby as well. If you look at the airport and the growth of warehousing in that area, you'll see that it's very situated next to the rail yards, and there's like a big intermodal facility, like maybe 5 miles east in Miraloma. But yeah, Miraloma, Ontario, that was kind of the epicenter of warehouse growth. And, historically, right, talking about history, some of the first warehouses that existed in that area were actually U.S. Army outposts, right?
Gotcha.
There was a quartermaster's depot in Miraloma that served not only for like the movement of like military equipment and medical supplies, but I learned through several professors at UC Riverside and others that place was a hub for the movement of people, aka unfortunately folks that were interned during Japanese folks that were interned during World War II.
Wow.
So that's the answer. I mean, you guessed right, but it makes sense because that area again has always been also a strategic place for goods movement.
Well, even like Colton, I mean, it was the hub city. They incorporated that into a part of their city identity, and they made it a selling point. It was a plus.
That's right. That's right. And it's still kind of a plus. I mean, they try to sell it as a plus. And I mean,
yes, it does have its benefits, of course. We're not knocking the benefits.
Yeah. And, again, with like, just to use the example of Colton as well, like Colton was built by basically, the construction of that city was influenced by this guy, David Dowdy Colton, who was like, hey, I'm this guy from San Francisco. I have a bunch of money. I have a bunch of connections. This is like the right place to build a rail yard hub, right? That escalated into some tensions. I'm sure you all know that there was like frog wars, which are basically like railroad wars between what's now Union Pacific and BNSF. And that's basically the origins of Colton and how it became the hub city, right? Was because, again, I think folks were like, San Bernardino is a great place for movement, right? It's growing. But where else in this area can we sort of like, lay down our roots? And it so happened that Colton was that perfect place, right? So
I want to take a second on moratoriums. I know in the most recent years, maybe the past few years, we've seen a lot of Inland Empire cities sort of try to push for a moratorium, either integrate a moratorium. Can you tell us what a moratorium does, how temporary it is, what the value is, and if any changes actually ever brought from moratoriums?
Yeah, so warehouse moratorium is basically a temporary pause, right? So in this case, a city will say, we are concerned about warehouse growth. We want to take a temporary pause in approving warehouse projects so that we can observe how this is impacting our community. So they put a pause. City councils can choose whether they can, if they want to do like a 30-day pause. We've seen 30-day pauses, 60-day pauses, 90-day pauses, 2-year moratoriums, right? Things like that. And so that's basically the motive. The effectiveness of them, I think it depends. I'll start with like moratorium. Sorry, I'm talking to the mic. I'll start with moratorium efforts that have failed in San Bernardino in particular. Former council member Ben Reynoso tried to present a warehouse moratorium. He failed, I think, after 2 attempts because there wasn't any support for it. I think people were like, well, warehouse growth is good in San Bernardino. This is great. In other places, like notably like in Jurupa Valley, for example, we've seen how a warehouse moratorium did have some kind of I don't want to say necessarily a positive impact, but it did allow the city to pause and reflect and eventually do a study. And in this case, they said, I think it was like a 1-year moratorium. They came back after the year and they said, hey, we're going to extend this for maybe a couple more months, I think. Right. And then they said, now we're going to pause the moratorium and we're going to present what we think is a good maybe solution or something to address this. And what they did is they said, we're going to do what's called the restricted truck route study. and then they implemented restricted truck routes in certain parts of the city where there was a lot of warehouse growth. So like Mira Loma, because that area has been historically impacted, so they have routes there. And then other parts of the city that are starting to see more growth, like, you know, in parts of Rubidoux, for example, or where the Colton, Bloomington, and Jurupa Valley borders exist as well. Yeah.
What would you say that people can do in their own communities, tangible efforts that just the everyday person can make to draw awareness to this, to push for, you know, that's also a misconception, is that if people question development, that they're against it, and that's not true.
No, that's not at all true.
And so what are some tangible efforts that people can make in their community?
Yeah, I think the first thing is tap into news, right? We're news people. So I would always say tap into your local news outlets, right? I mean, you have a plethora now. You know, a lot of them are small outlets, albeit they're really strong outlets, right? I mean, there's two in the room right now, right? I would say also tap into local organizations that are doing this work. So I mentioned two of them, right? The People's Collective for Environmental Justice, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. What we're seeing now is that there's smaller groups that are sprouting up, groups like Concerned Neighbors of Bloomington, the Mead Valley Coalition for Clean Air, the Paris Neighbors in Action, all these different groups that have sprouted up as a result of this issue. So tap into those groups. If you're someone that's like, I don't know if I want to be a part of a group, I'm just a concerned mother, I'm just a concerned parent, I'm just a concerned citizen, you know, you can start by following your local, you know, city council agendas, looking at the planning commissions. I always tell people a warehouse project, it always starts with your local planning commission. And that, you know, that's where the process starts. So, you know, don't underestimate the power of planning commissions and like those lower government bodies that you see on city councils or in the county. I think also, if you have concerns about air quality, you know, the South Coast Air Quality Management District does provide very consistent alerts, whether it be smoke advisories, whether it be air quality advisories, and you could sign up for those alerts, and you could sign up.
Is it an app?
I think I don't know if they have an app, but like, excuse me, if you sign up on their website, if you go to their website and you go to like their news and media section, you could sign up for like the newsletter or like their email alerts. And you get those like
their Instagram is great too, though. They're always updating constantly. So I feel like everything that they send out in their newsletter is always kind of posted on, any alert is on Instagram, Facebook too. So
the community engagement is critical.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, I know residents can feel like their voices aren't being heard, but it sounds like from some of the examples you've given, it does make a difference. It does.
It does make a difference, especially with agencies like the AQMD. I think I would argue that the warehouse indirect source, well, both indirect source rules, frankly, were adopted and approved because of the community advocacy, because people were calling, whether it be, you know, and that's the other thing about the AQMD, just a quick side note, is that the AQMD and CARB, the California Air Resources Board, are made up of representatives of, so in AQMD's case, they're made up of local city council members or the mayors of cities or supervisors. So you'll see, like, for example, I think in our area, I think Riverside's mayor is on the board. I want to say, is Larry McAllen still on the board? Maybe. Larry McAllen?
I heard he recently was off the board, but Patricia Locke, right, from mayor of Riverside.
Yeah, Mayor Patricia Locke Dawson. That's correct. She's on the board, and she's actually a good person. Well, arguably in the eyes of advocates, she's like a decent appointment because if you're paying attention to what she's doing in Riverside, she's basically trying to make Riverside into like a greener city, right? And so, you know, that's an example.
Their city buses, they just recently integrated a contract with a electric company, basically. And I don't know, that looks like it's I'm just judging off of the photos. It looks cool. But I know there's got to be some added benefits to that. And have you tapped into what those are?
I have tapped into it. You know, it's funny. My colleague at the station at KVCR, Sharina Wad, was looking into, I think the company's name Omni or Omni, something like that. And they're like small shuttles, right? I think that's fascinating. And it could work in a place like Riverside because of their downtown feel and stuff. In action, as we know, you know, we've seen like the examples of SBX and how that's come about, and we can go on all day on SBX. But no, to your point, like, I think her appointment is key because she brings a lot of insight. I think her background is in like environmental science or something to that effect. So she does have like insight and knowledge. And I think it's fascinating to see like the leadership is shifting in that sense too in places like Riverside.
Right.
I think
traditionally it seems like they've resisted regulations and things like that, citing economic burdens usually. So it would be nice to have someone who sees the benefit of it and advocates for it.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, the IE, I think people have argued that in the last couple of years, the board members of the Inland Empire have been kind of anti, like, regulation. So, like, I know in the past, Janice Rutherford, who used to be a supervisor, she would always vote against things like the ISR. I'm trying to think of others that have gone through. Supervisor Josie Gonzalez as well. I think she was on the board at one time. She was also kind of like anti-regulation. Larry McAllen, and others, right? The other person I forget that's on the board is Supervisor Manuel Perez out of Riverside County. He's he's supervisor as well. But all that to say that, like, you know, you can call these folks because they are elected representatives, and you can ask them, hey, man, like, you know, I see you're on the AQMD and I'm concerned about this. What are you doing to address my air quality, right? So always calling your elected officials is key, because if they don't answer, a field rep will answer, and they do log their calls. They do keep track. So that it's key. That does make a difference.
Another great resource too that I think sometimes people forget about in the community is public comment at city council meetings, public comment, planning commission meetings. There's always designated time to speak, and I can't tell you how many city council meetings I've been to or watched online, and there's big items being discussed and they have one comment. But then online on social media, there's an uproar about the issue. But a lot of times I think those public comments weigh way more when they're, you know, on public record like that from a city page, opposed to, you know, just upset about it on social media, which is important too, to kind of voice it wherever you see fit. But the most important and vital place is public comment during those meetings.
Your voice can't be heard if you don't speak.
I agree. And I think if you can't make it, because I know sometimes, you know, complications and things, writing a letter, because that letter, to your point, is also a part of the public record. So, but I think I always encourage people, if you can make it to a city council meeting, you can make it to an AQMD meeting, going in person is always more impactful. And when you have a strong story, I've seen time and time again, especially on this issue, where you have a community member that goes up with a testimony, and it's so compelling that it compels the board to say, you know what, I heard you, and they'll address people, you know, in person. I mean, this is kind of a different issue, but recently on immigration, right? At the Board of Supervisors meeting, I covered, you know, Riverside County passed a resolution to affirm their support of immigrants. There was a student who went up there, and, you know, I could tell, you know, you could tell he was a little nervous, but he spoke from the heart. And there was like at least 3 supervisors after the fact that were like, hey, young man, great job. Like, we appreciate your public comment. And so, you know, it goes back to the point that you never know how compelling your testimony can be until you actually get up there. And
it personifies the issue.
Absolutely.
Especially when it's someone who you're literally dealing with that in your own everyday life, or could possibly be dealing with those impacts. So,
exactly.
Yeah. Also, can you tell us how many, you don't have to give an exact number, but is it true that there are dozens of empty warehouses across the Inland Empire? I know the answer to this, but...
Yeah, there is. I don't know the exact number, but there for sure is.
Yeah.
And that's another concern, is you're basically, you know, and I mean, even warehouses that haven't been built. I mean, if you want to look at it this way, but I think to answer the stuff about the vacant warehouses, think about the land or the buildings that have been leveled. To just have a vacant warehouse, right? And then also think about Bloomington, right? And I know I keep going back to Bloomington, but it's key. Like in Bloomington, you have literally open space right now where there used to be, you know, several acres of housing. There used to be, you know, Zimmerman Elementary is still there, but at some point it's going to be leveled as well. So you have to think about, like, you know, you're doing all this leveling, you're doing all this development of warehousing, only for it to sit vacant, or only for some of that land to sit empty in general for several years.
Again, quality of life.
Quality of life.
I do know that in the fall, or as of the fall 2024, there was 8 vacant warehouses in Rialto.
Okay.
Just in Rialto alone, which I'm thinking, there's so many IE cities. There has to, like, it's potential that there's like over 50.
That might be a good story idea, y'all. Just, you know.
We'll hit you up on that.
Yeah.
Well, Anthony, thank you for joining us. Where can we find more about you? Where can people follow you? Where can they read your stories, keep up with you, all that stuff?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram more so at Aya the Barrio. I do have a Twitter/X, but I don't really use it, to be honest. So I would say Instagram is the preferred platform if you want to catch my reporting. If you want to read our stories through the Frontline Observer, visit www.frontline-observer.com. Happy to share that we do have a collaboration with Inland Empire Community News. So, sometimes you are also able to read our stories on IECN's website or through print if you at your local newsstand. If you want to catch my audio reporting, my broadcast reporting, you can just visit kvcrnews.org. Also collaborate sometimes with them on my environmental justice reporting through Frontline Observer. In fact, the reporting on Bloomington is one of those collaborations. So that's where you can find me in a nutshell.
Briefly describe Aya the Barrio, because I know obviously it's newish. So can you explain really quick what that is about?
Aya the Barrio. So Aya the Barrio is actually, I love sharing this story. So I have a friend, and some of y'all might know him as Agual. He's a musician. He's a part of Milpa, which is a band that performs sometimes. So he, I met him when I was a younger reporter. I think I might have been a student here actually at the time. I was working with IECN, and I was at an event, and he was like, "Hey, what's up, Aya the Barrio?" Like, cause I'm in the community, and I was like, "Oh man, I like that." And since then, I kind of it caught on, and I decided, you know what, I'm gonna turn that into my handle. So that's where the name Aya the Barrio comes from.
That's awesome. And you kind of share stuff about, is it San Bernardino? Is it Colton as well?
Oh, I think you're referring to Buzón del Barrio.
Oh, exactly. That one. Okay, that too though. Can you mention that really quick?
So Buzón del Barrio. So basically, Buzón del Barrio came about because Listening Post Collective did this media study on our region, as you all know. They created an Instagram page called Listening Post Collective Inland Empire. So what basically happened is I took over that social media page, and with the help of some other folks, rebranded that page, right? And so Buzón del Barrio, it's a work in progress, but the goal of it is basically media literacy and to serve as a news aggregator, right? So I think our goal is to try to not only talk about like media literacy through Frontline Observer, but also, be collaborative and share the great work of partners like you all and others that are a part of our ecosystem, right? If that makes sense.
Thanks for sharing that. I was also interested. The Aya the Barrio, Buzón del Barrio. You have all the Barrio handles on there. But Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate you both. Thank you so much.
Everyone, Inland Empire, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. You guys can keep up with us at iecn.com, on our Instagram and Facebook at IE Community News. My name is Manny.
I'm Denise.
And we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.